In this section, we are going to start cranial nerves, the anatomy of cranial nerves. So first of all, we are going to discuss the anatomy of oculomotor nerve. So that's the cranial nerve third, which is the oculomotor nerve. Now this oculomotor nerve, it provides supply to most of the extraocular muscles of eye. We are going to see that in the coming sections. So first of all, let's have an overview about the origin of all the nerves from the brainstem. So if this is a diagram of the midbrain, so below midbrain is the pons. So this part is the pons, and below pons is the medulla. So this is the midline, this is the pyramid of the medulla, and this is the olive. This is pyramid of the other side and olive of the other side, and this is the continuation of brainstem. So the uppermost part, this is the midbrain. Uppermost part is the midbrain, below midbrain is the pons, and the lowermost part is the medulla. In the medulla, this part is the pyramid of the medulla, and the adjacent part is the olive of the medulla. Now, cranial nerves, starting from 3, they all arise from the brainstem. So cranial nerve third arises from the midbrain, from the ventral aspect, and cranial nerve number 4 also arises from the midbrain but from the dorsal aspect. Cranial nerve number 5 arises from the pons. So if this is the midline, so cranial nerve number 5, this is cranial nerve 5 of the one side, it arises from the pons, anterior ventral aspect of the pons. And from the junction of pons and medulla, cranial nerve number 6, cranial nerve number 7 and 8, they arise. So cranial nerve 6, 7 and 8, they arise from the junction of pons and the medulla, that's junction of pons and pyramid and the olive. Now, from the junction of pyramid and olive, a cranial nerve arises, which is cranial nerve number 9. So this is cranial nerve number 12. Cranial nerve number 12 arises from the junction of pons and olive. Cranial nerve number 9 arises from the junction of olive and the midbrain, and cranial nerve number 10 arises from the olive, that's from the medulla. Cranial nerve number 11 has 3 parts, that is the spinal part and the cranial part. So one part arises from the spinal cord and other from the medulla of the brainstem, and they form cranial nerve number 11, that is accessory nerve. So these are the cranial nerves which arise from the brainstem. So the main nerve that we are going to discuss in this section is the third cranial nerve, that is oculomotor nerve. Now, as we saw in this diagram, it arises from the ventral aspect of the midbrain. So if this is the sagittal section of the brainstem, these are superior inferior colliculi, this is the fourth ventricle. So let us label it. This part is the midbrain, this is pons, this is medulla, this is the fourth ventricle, and these are superior and the inferior colliculi. So the upper one is the superior colliculus and the lower one is the inferior colliculus. And now this cranial nerve number third, that's oculomotor nerve, it arises from the ventral aspect of the midbrain. So this is midbrain, and from the ventral aspect of the midbrain, the nerve which arises is cranial nerve number third, and cranial nerve number 4, it arises from the dorsal aspect of the midbrain and then comes to the ventral aspect. So these are two cranial nerves. Now if we take a look at the section of midbrain at the level of superior colliculus, so let me draw a section of the midbrain at the level of superior colliculus. So this is the midbrain, this is crus cerebri of the midbrain, this is the central aqueduct, periaqueductal gray. Now the nucleus from which the third cranial nerve, that's oculomotor nerve, arises is present ventral to the periaqueductal gray, and this is a whole complex of nuclei. It's called as oculomotor complex. It consists of several nuclei. This oculomotor complex and oculomotor nerve arises ventrally from the midbrain from this very complex. So this is the third cranial nerve on each side, that's oculomotor nerve. Now we are going to discuss this oculomotor complex in detail. As I already said, it consists of several nuclei which are arranged to form the oculomotor complex. Now let us discuss the oculomotor complex in detail. Oculomotor complex. So before starting this, let us again go through the location of oculomotor complex in the section of midbrain at the level of superior colliculus. So this is the midbrain at the level of superior colliculus. This is the crest cerebri, central aqueduct, periaqueductal gray, and this here on the ventral aspect is the oculomotor complex from which oculomotor nerve arises. So several nuclei are a part of oculomotor complex. So let us start with these two basic nuclei. So let us name them as nucleus number 1 and nucleus number 2. So nucleus number 1 is called as the Raphe nucleus. So oculomotor nucleus, the first nucleus is the Raphe nucleus, and this nucleus provides somatic visceral fibers to superior rectus muscle. So these all are extraocular muscles. So somatic efferent fibers from these nuclei, they go to the extraocular muscles. From the Raphe nucleus, somatic efferent fibers, they go to superior rectus muscle. Second nucleus is called as the caudal central nucleus. So the nucleus number 2 that we can see in the diagram is the caudal central nucleus, which provides somatic efferent fibers to levator palpebrae superioris muscle. Now lateral to these two nuclei, there's another nucleus which is present on either side. So this is nucleus number 3. So there's a pair of this nucleus. It's present on each side. Nucleus number 3 is called as the ventral medial nucleus. Ventral medial nucleus. This nucleus provides somatic efferent supply to the medial rectus muscle, which is again an extraocular muscle. Now lateral to this nucleus, that is ventral medial nucleus, is another nucleus, that's nucleus number 4. Again it's present on both the sides. This is called as the intermediate nucleus. So nucleus number 4, so I'm going to write it here. Nucleus number 4 is called as the intermediate nucleus, and this nucleus, it provides somatic efferent supply to internal oblique muscle. The muscle, its internal oblique muscle. Now lateral to this nucleus, that is lateral to intermediate nucleus, we have another pair of nuclei. These are called as the dorsal medial nucleus. So nucleus number 5, again on both sides, this nucleus number 5 is called as the dorsal medial nucleus, dorsal lateral nucleus. This dorsal lateral nucleus, it provides somatic efferent fibers to inferior rectus muscle. So all these nuclei, they provide somatic efferent fibers to extraocular muscles, and just above and lateral to dorsal lateral nucleus on each side, there is another nucleus which is called as the Edinger Westphal nucleus. Edinger Westphal nucleus, the fibers from this nucleus are parasympathetic in nature, and they go to ciliary ganglion. So ciliary ganglion is a parasympathetic ganglion, and the postganglionic fibers from ciliary ganglion, they supply sphincter pupillae as well as ciliaris muscles. So these fibers go to the eye and supply sphincter pupillae and ciliaris muscles. We'll see this in the diagram as well. So now these are the nuclei. So this is the dorsal lateral nucleus and the Edinger Westphal nucleus. Now I'm going to draw these two nuclei here. This is the dorsal lateral nucleus, and above and lateral to it is the Edinger Westphal nucleus. Edinger Westphal nucleus. Now the fibers of the Edinger Westphal nucleus, they are parasympathetic in nature, and these fibers, they go to the ciliary ganglion. So ciliary ganglion is a peripheral parasympathetic ganglion. So the efferents come from the Edinger Westphal nucleus, and the postganglionic fibers from this, they go to the eye. So if this is eyeball, this is the transverse section, this is the cornea. So in this, there are two muscles. This is sphincter pupillae and this is ciliaris muscle. So ciliaris muscle and sphincter pupillae muscle. So the postganglionic fibers from the ciliary ganglion, they provide parasympathetic supply to these two muscles, that is sphincter pupillae as well as ciliaris muscles. So these fibers are parasympathetic fibers. They are also called as general visceral efferent fibers. General visceral efferent fibers, which provide supply to these muscles. general visceral efferent fibers. Now, ciliary ganglion will be discussed in detail in a separate video. Now let us discuss the course of oculomotor nerve. So, if we start right from the origin of the oculomotor nerve from the brainstem, so this is the section of midbrain at the level of superior colliculus. So this is the periaqueductal gray, and here is the crest cerebri. Now, when in the ventral aspect of periaqueductal gray, there is oculomotor complex from which oculomotor nerve arises. So now, dorsal to brainstem, we have the artery which is called as the basilar artery, and this basilar artery gives various branches. So this is the basilar artery. It gives various branches, and so the branches that we are concerned about here, these are this branch is called as the posterior cerebral artery, and the lower branch is called as the superior cerebellar artery. So posterior cerebral artery, it gives a branch which is called as the posterior communicating artery. Now these branches, the upper two branches, they form the circle of Willis, the lower aspect. So posterior communicating artery, and the lower one is the superior cerebellar artery. Now above this, these are the clinoid processes. So this is the the posterior clinoid process. These are the two posterior clinoid processes, and anterior to them are the two anterior clinoid processes. So these are the two anterior clinoid processes. This is the superior orbital fissure. Now the superior orbital fissure is divided into three parts by tendinous ring of Zen. So this is the tendinous ring which divides it into three parts. And so in front of the superior orbital fissure there is this orbit. So this is the orbit in front of superior orbital fissure. Now in the orbit, the main muscles which are supplied by this nerve, these are extraocular muscles. So this muscle is the levator palpebrae superioris muscle, and this is superior oblique. This muscle is superior rectus. On the lateral aspect there is lateral rectus. Medially there is medial rectus. Similarly, opposite to superior oblique there is inferior oblique, and then there is inferior rectus. Now in the center, through the center, the optic nerve passes. So this is the position of the optic nerve, and in between optic nerve and lateral rectus there is ciliary ganglion. We are going to see it in a few moments. Now let us discuss the course of oculomotor nerve. So oculomotor nerve originates from the oculomotor complex. It comes out from the brainstem, then it passes between. So first it comes out from the oculomotor complex and passes through the ventral aspect of the midbrain. Then it passes between these two arteries, that is between superior cerebellar artery and the posterior cerebral artery. Then it goes lateral to the posterior communicating artery. It moves forward lateral to the posterior communicating artery, and then it passes through the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. So let me show the location of cavernous sinus. So this is the location of the cavernous sinus. This is cavernous sinus. Now it enters the lateral wall by piercing the roof of cavernous sinus. The roof is pierced on the posterolateral aspect. So it pierces the posterolateral aspect of the roof of cavernous sinus and enters into the lateral wall. Then it passes through the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. So number 5, it passes through the lateral wall of cavernous sinus, and when it reaches near the superior orbital fissure, it divides into two branches, that is superior and inferior branch. Okay, then it divides into two branches, superior and inferior branch, and both pass through the superior orbital fissure, through the middle part of the superior orbital fissure. Okay. Now the inferior branch, I am going to show it with dotted line, and the superior branch I am going to use a normal line. So the superior branch of the oculomotor nerve, it enters the orbit and passes through optic nerve and the lateral rectus and provides supply to levator palpebris superioris and the superior rectus. So this is superior division which passes between optic nerve, lateral rectus and provides supply to these muscles. The inferior division, it also enters into the orbit and provides supply to medial rectus, inferior rectus and inferior oblique, and the branch which goes to inferior oblique gives another branch which goes to the ciliary ganglion. So this is the location of ciliary ganglion in between optic nerve and the lateral rectus. Ciliary ganglion, so one of the branches goes to the ciliary ganglion, and the parasympathetic fibers from ciliary ganglion then go to sphincter pupillae and the ciliaris muscle. So this is the course of the oculomotor nerve. Now there are only two muscles which are not supplied by oculomotor nerve. These are superior oblique and lateral rectus. So we can remember it as LR6 SO4. It means lateral rectus is supplied by cranial nerve 6 and superior oblique by cranial nerve 4. Remaining all are supplied by cranial nerve number 3. So that's all about the oculomotor nerve. Thank you.